I'm going to talk a little bit about communities and the experience that we have at Enbridge of working with local communities. My team and I spend a lot of our time on the right-of-way, meeting with people, talking to them about issues, and I'm going to use a few examples from a pipeline project that we are currently in construction on in Canada. And if you haven't heard about it, I'm very, very happy about that because it means we're doing our job. I'm actually maybe going to be a little more optimistic than some people have been, because in our work with local communities and local community leaders, we're seeing a lot of really positive outcomes. We have actually changed our approach to community engagement. It used to be, and I think this is kind of the case for industry, it was very transactional. Our engagement was based on activity on the right-of-way. If we were in a growth mode and we were building something on the right-of-way, we were very active and we were talking to people about what we were doing. In between times, we weren't quite so active. So we've changed our approach completely and moved to a life cycle engagement approach, where our engagement with communities is ongoing. It's based on the life cycle of our assets in those locations and on those rights of way. And so we're not even talking that much about early engagement anymore. Because we are constantly talking to people about issues that they may have and about concerns that they may have and how we can address them. We actually we have annual planning cycles with our operations teams, so that each of our operating regions has an annual engagement plan that they are tasked with implementing, and their performance is scored on how well they're implementing that plan. So it's really become embedded in the culture and embedded in our work approach at Enbridge. Community engagement is critical, and our employees live and work in these communities as well. So they're part of these communities and want to talk about what Enbridge does, how we do it, and answer any questions that they might have. So we really are always in engagement mode, whether we're going into a regulatory process or not. Obviously, we scale up if we are proposing some growth activity, but the intention is to be constantly out there talking to people, answering their questions, and we're finding that has really borne out a lot of fruit. And that's not, because it also, we're finding that people don't just have questions when we're trying to build something. They want to know about how we're actually operating. They have questions about our operations. And so it's important that we're able to provide them with that information, and we have a strong relationship with them that is based on those shared values. Our people live and work in those communities as well. And a lot of the conversations that we have, even when we're in growth mode, because I know there's a lot of focus when we're talking about this stuff on economic benefits, but frankly, our experience is that before we can even talk about economic benefits, we've got to talk about things like land and water and what it is that we're doing to ensure that we're protecting the land and water in that community. And this is for Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So as an example, we're building our Line 3 replacement right now. We have had, it's over 1,500 kilometers, crosses 3 provinces and 3 states. And we have had, just in Canada, over 14,000 engagement activities related to that project. And that is in addition to and part of those regional engagement plans that I just mentioned that are ongoing and are refreshed annually. So it really is becoming part of our DNA as pipeliners, that we are out there as often as possible and as much as possible, answering people's questions and talking to them about things that are important to them. And this is, I can give you some examples of those conversations leading to changes in our route, moving around something of importance to a community. We talk with communities about where to place valves, where their water intake is for their communities, so that we can make sure that we're completely understanding the priorities and what we need to do to protect what those assets and what the important things are to those communities. So there's a lot of that activity that just happens day to day today. That goes for Indigenous communities as well. I know we've talked a lot about Indigenous communities earlier, but I do want to make a point about what we've been able to do with Indigenous communities on Line 3, because we had to consult with about 150 communities or groups up to 300 kilometers away from our right-of-way, and we've reached agreements with 75 of those communities or organizations, and those agreements are normally based on proximity to the right-of-way and therefore impact. But really critical is that we have already, and we still have another year of construction to go in Canada, we've already provided over $100 million of business opportunity to Indigenous-owned businesses, and we anticipate that number to be close to $300 million before we're finished construction. And the really encouraging thing is that 10 years ago when we constructed in that right-of-way, those numbers were, I think, about $40 million. So I think that really shows both how our change in approach and our understanding of the importance of all of this is having an impact, but it also speaks to the increased capacity of those communities and how they're able to deliver. Almost all of our pre-construction work was done by Indigenous-owned businesses. So we're pretty happy that we've been able to make that happen. I also want to say that on that Line 3 project, we have 100% of landowners in Canada and 95% of the landowners in the United States are agreed with and signed agreements with Enbridge for this project. So as much as we hear all this noise, the communities that are actually directly impacted by this, if you have spent the time to understand the values, understand the concerns and the interests, and spent the time to develop a relationship with the leadership of the community, you can make significant progress. And so in that sense, I'm optimistic about how some of these things are going, particularly with local communities. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no noise. I mean, you know, we all know that, but the people who are most directly impacted, the people who are living with our infrastructure, living with our activity on a day-to-day basis, we have strong relationships with them, and we're able to keep those relationships going. But you can't let yourself be sort of bound or governed by what is compliance? What do we have to do to be compliant with the rules? You have to go beyond that, and I think it was Jeff and others who've spoken about the fact that you really have to focus on what those shared values are and understand the values of the communities that you're working in. The other point I want to make is that we've talked about and raised the issue of needing to define where local authority begins and ends. But I'm not so sure if we're going to be able to define that, or if that's something that communities and in partnership with industry are going to start to define. That's certainly what we're seeing, that communities know what they want, they know what their concerns are, and if you're willing to sit down with them, you can move that relationship forward, and they feel part of it, and they are part of the decision. They are part of how you're either running your business or how you are building your business. So I think it's an important point to make, that is happening naturally, whether there are rules governing it or not. The only other point I want to make is Mike's reference to policy failure. On that one, I'm not quite as optimistic, because I think we have seen that without clarity of policy, and whatever that policy is, I'm not going to make a judgment about that. We just need clarity as to what are the objectives of the country or the province of the state. I mean, we work in 65 different jurisdictions in North America, so we're always having to grapple with this. So we don't make judgments about what the policy is. When a policy decision is made, we do what's necessary for us to ensure that we are compliant with that policy. Obviously, we try to have input, but but once it's made, we try to be compliant with it. However, when it's constantly changing, or when you aren't clear on what the objectives are, and I'll give you an example from the United States, because we're building, there's in the northeastern United States, in New England, everybody knows there's major gas deposits. They're right next door. But rather than building infrastructure to move that gas into New England so that they can deal with some extreme weather, and we saw that this winter, they're stalling, they're forgetting the objective. The objective is to reduce emissions. So rather than having infrastructure that can bring gas from next door into New England when the cyclone bomb, or whatever they called it, hit, so they could warm it, they burned a few million barrels of oil, and then brought in a Russian tanker full of LNG. So you have to ask yourself, what is it we're trying to achieve? Because if we're trying to just not build pipelines, then let's be clear about that. But if we're actually trying to reduce emissions, there are better ways to do it. So as a pipeliner, we're kind of at the pointy edge of the spear on this, and have been for quite some time. We have some very strong views about the new regulatory process that has been proposed by the federal government. We don't think it provides that clarity. It doesn't provide clarity on policy or national interest at the right time in the process. There's a number of other issues on standing, on timing, on timelines, on what is going to get caught in the impact assessment process, and what is going to be governed by the Canadian Energy Regulator. There's a number of questions that don't really provide a lot of guidance, and so that is where I'm less optimistic, is that we're going to be able to actually have a process that people think works, because we are so polarized, and I'm just not really sure where that's going to get us. But it may accomplish one thing. We may not have a lot of applications to build more pipelines, and if that was the objective, then we may achieve that objective. I think I'm ending on a less optimistic note, but you know, we're gonna continue doing what we're doing. We're really pleased with how our relationships with those local communities work, and hopefully we can continue to do that.